The radar screens lit up just after midnight. Across the Middle East, air defense operators watched clusters of signals move steadily across their monitors, fast, coordinated, closing in. Within minutes, sirens began to sound, fighter aircraft scrambled, missile batteries rotated toward the sky. In several locations, the darkness erupted into sudden flashes of light as interceptors launched upward. This was not a routine alert. On February 28, 2026, Israel, together with the United States, launched a coordinated series of airstrikes on Iranian targets in what officials would later call Operation Epic Fury. For years, Iran and Israel had fought a hidden conflict, one conducted through proxies, covert operations, and carefully limited strikes. But on this night, the shadow war stepped into the open, and the world was forced to confront a question decades in the making. How did two countries that once cooperated, even quietly worked together, become some of the most determined adversaries in the modern Middle East? To understand how the Middle East arrived at this moment, the story must rewind nearly 80 years, back to 1948, the year the State of Israel was created. In the months that followed its declaration of independence, Israel faced immediate hostility from many governments across the region. War broke out almost instantly, and diplomatic recognition from neighboring states was nearly non-existent. But one country made a different calculation: Iran. Despite the political sensitivities of the region, Iran chose to recognize the newly formed state. The decision was cautious and measured, but it established a diplomatic reality that many observers today find surprising. For the next 3 decades, relations between Iran and Israel remained quietly functional. During the reign of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran pursued a pragmatic foreign policy. The Shah saw his country as a regional power aligned with Western interests and deeply concerned about the spread of Soviet influence in the Middle East. Israel, similarly isolated within the region, was searching for partners wherever it could find them. And in Iran, it found one. The relationship was rarely advertised in public. In the politics of the Middle East, open cooperation with Israel carried enormous political risk. But behind the scenes, connections deepened. Israel imported Iranian oil, a valuable supply for a country with limited energy resources. Economic exchanges grew quietly through the 1950s and 1960s. Security cooperation also developed. Intelligence officials from both countries reportedly maintained contacts, sharing information about regional threats and political movements that could destabilize their governments. It was a partnership built less on ideology and more on strategy. Both states saw themselves surrounded by uncertainty. Both feared hostile alliances forming around them, and for a time, cooperation made sense. Yet, beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would eventually transform Iran, and with it, the entire relationship. By the late 1970s, the Shah's rule was becoming increasingly unstable. Protests spread across Iran, economic pressures mounted, religious and political opposition grew louder with each passing month. Few outside observers could fully predict what was about to happen. But when the political earthquake finally arrived, it would not only reshape Iran, it would redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East, and it would turn a quiet partnership into one of the region's most enduring rivalries. In the late 1970s, the stability of Iran's political system began to unravel. For decades, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled the country as a powerful monarch, backed by a strong military and close relationships with Western governments. His rule had transformed Iran into one of the most modernized states in the region, but modernization came with deep tensions. Rapid economic change widened inequality. Political opposition was suppressed. Religious leaders criticized the government's secular policies and its close ties with Western powers. Across Iranian cities, protests began to grow. What started as scattered demonstrations soon turned into mass movements. Millions of people filled the streets. Strikes paralyzed industries. The government struggled to regain control. By early 1979, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Shah left Iran. Within weeks, a revolutionary movement led by the exiled cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to the country and seized political power. The Islamic Revolution, had begun. Iran was no longer a monarchy aligned with Western governments. It was becoming an Islamic republic built on a radically different political vision. And with that transformation came a dramatic shift in foreign policy. The new leadership rejected many of the Shah's alliances, especially those connected to the United States and Israel. Diplomatic relations with Israel were immediately severed. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed and handed over to representatives of the Palestinian cause, a symbolic gesture that signaled the direction Iran's new government intended to take. From that moment forward, Israel was no longer viewed as a quiet partner in the region. It was described instead as an illegitimate state and a central opponent in Iran's new ideological worldview. What had once been a cautious strategic relationship had collapsed almost overnight. Yet despite the sharp rhetoric and diplomatic rupture, the two countries did not move directly into open war. Instead, the conflict entered a different phase, one that would unfold far from their borders and often far from public view. For decades, the rivalry between Iran and Israel would be fought in the shadows. After the Iranian Revolution, the rivalry between Iran and Israel did not erupt into direct war. Instead, it evolved into something far more complex, a conflict fought across borders, through allies, militias, and political movements, a proxy war. In the early 1980s, Iran began building relationships with groups across the Middle East that opposed Israel. These alliances would become one of the most important tools in Tehran's regional strategy. The most significant of these partnerships emerged in Lebanon. Following Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon in 1982, a new Shiite militant organization began to take shape. With support, funding, and training from Iran's Revolutionary Guard, that organization would become known as Hezbollah. Over time, Hezbollah grew into one of the most powerful non-state armed groups in the region. It developed thousands of rockets, an extensive military structure, and deep political influence inside Lebanon itself. For Iran, Hezbollah became both a deterrent and a strategic partner, a force capable of threatening Israel, without requiring direct Iranian military involvement. But Lebanon was not the only arena. In the Palestinian territories, Iran also built connections with groups opposed to Israel, including Hamas. While the relationship between Iran and Hamas was sometimes complicated by ideological differences, their shared opposition to Israel created a strategic alignment. Financial support, military training, and weapons transfers helped strengthen these organizations over time. For Israel, these developments represented a growing security challenge. The country now faced threats not only from neighboring states, but from armed groups positioned along its borders, groups with ties to Tehran. Rocket attacks, border clashes, and intermittent conflicts became recurring features of the regional landscape. Yet even as tensions rose, the confrontation remained indirect. Iranian and Israeli forces rarely engaged each other directly. Instead, the rivalry unfolded through networks of allies, covert support, and carefully calibrated responses. Both sides understood the risks of full-scale war. A direct conflict between Iran and Israel could pull multiple countries into the fighting and destabilize the entire region. So for years, the struggle remained largely hidden. But the Middle East was changing. New battlegrounds were emerging, and one country in particular would soon become the center of the next phase of this long rivalry: Syria. A war there would open an entirely new front in the conflict between Iran and Israel. For decades, the rivalry between Iran and Israel remained largely indirect, but by the early 21st century, the geography of that conflict began to change, and the country at the center of that transformation was Syria. When civil war erupted in Syria in 2011, it quickly became one of the most complex conflicts of the modern era. Multiple factions, foreign governments, and militant groups all became involved, each pursuing their own strategic interests. For Iran, the stakes were extremely high. Syria had long been one of Tehran's most important regional allies. The government of President Bashar al-Assad provided Iran with a crucial corridor of influence stretching from Tehran through Iraq and Syria all the way to Lebanon. That corridor allowed Iran to supply Hezbollah with weapons, equipment, and financial support. If the Syrian government collapsed, that entire network could be severed. So Iran moved decisively to protect its ally. Advisors from Iran's Revolutionary Guard deployed to Syria. Military equipment flowed into the country. Shiite militias from Iraq and other regions were mobilized to support the Syrian government's forces. Over time, Iran's military footprint inside Syria steadily expanded. For Israel, this development triggered deep concern. From the Israeli perspective, Iran was not simply supporting an ally. It was building a military infrastructure dangerously close to Israel's borders. Intelligence reports suggested that Iranian forces and affiliated militias were establishing bases, transferring advanced weapon systems, and strengthening Hezbollah's arsenal. If that process continued unchecked, Israel feared it could face a far more dangerous strategic environment, one in which Iranian forces operated directly from Syrian territory. Israel's response was swift and deliberate. Beginning in the 2000s, Israeli aircraft launched a growing number of airstrikes against targets in Syria linked to Iranian forces or Hezbollah. Weapons depots were hit, convoys transporting missiles were destroyed, military installations believed to house Iranian personnel were repeatedly targeted. Most of these strikes occurred without formal declarations of war. Often, they were not even officially acknowledged, but their purpose was clear. Israel intended to prevent Iran from entrenching itself militarily in Syria, and Iran in turn continued to expand its regional network despite the risks. The pattern became increasingly familiar. A strike, a quiet retaliation, another strike, another warning. Both sides were carefully managing escalation, pushing against each other while trying to avoid a direct full-scale confrontation. But the rivalry was no longer confined to shadows alone. The battlefield had expanded, and the next phase of the conflict would reach far beyond Syria, into diplomacy, cyber warfare, and one of the most controversial security issues in the modern Middle East: Iran's nuclear program. While the confrontation between Iran and Israel was expanding across the region, another issue was steadily rising to the center of the rivalry: Iran's nuclear program. For Tehran, nuclear technology had long been framed as a matter of national sovereignty. Iranian leaders insisted that their program was designed for civilian purposes: energy production, medical research, and scientific development. But many governments, particularly Israel, viewed the program very differently. From Israel's perspective, the possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran represented an existential threat. Israel is a small country with limited geographic depth. A hostile state possessing nuclear weapons, especially one whose leaders openly rejected Israel's legitimacy, would fundamentally change the strategic balance of the region. The concern was not simply theoretical. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, international inspectors and intelligence agencies closely monitored Iran's nuclear activities. Facilities were built deep underground. Enrichment technologies improved. Stockpiles of enriched uranium grew. The international community responded with diplomacy and pressure. Sanctions were imposed. Negotiations began. Talks stretched across years as diplomats attempted to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities while avoiding a wider regional crisis. For a time, it appeared that a compromise might be possible. In 2015, Iran and several world powers reached an agreement intended to restrict Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from international sanctions. Supporters argued the deal reduced the immediate risk of nuclear proliferation in the region. Critics, however, believed it merely delayed the problem. Among the strongest opponents was Israel. Israeli leaders warned that Iran could eventually resume nuclear development once restrictions expired. From their perspective, the agreement did not eliminate the threat. It postponed it. Behind the scenes, the confrontation over the nuclear issue increasingly moved into the realm of covert conflict. Cyber operations targeted nuclear facilities. Sensitive installations were reportedly sabotaged. Scientists connected to the nuclear program were assassinated in mysterious attacks. Responsibility for these incidents was rarely acknowledged publicly, but many observers believed they reflected a broader struggle between Iran and Israel, one designed to slow nuclear development without triggering open war. Years passed under this uneasy balance. Diplomacy continued, often punctuated by crises. Sanctions were tightened, then debated, then revised. Negotiations resumed, stalled, and resumed again. Throughout it all, the rivalry between Iran and Israel remained one of the most volatile dynamics in the Middle East, a conflict still largely hidden from direct battlefield confrontation. But that fragile equilibrium would not last forever. In October 2023, a sudden and devastating attack would ignite a new phase of regional tension, one that threatened to pull Iran and Israel closer to direct confrontation than ever before. In the early hours of October 7, 2023, the fragile balance that had defined the region for years suddenly shattered. Before sunrise, militants from the Palestinian group Hamas launched a large-scale attack against Israel. Thousands of rockets were fired toward Israeli cities. At the same time, armed fighters crossed the border from Gaza into Israeli communities and military positions. The assault unfolded across multiple locations, catching much of the country by surprise. For Israel, the attack was one of the most devastating security breaches in its modern history. Within hours, the government declared that the country was at war. Israeli forces mobilized rapidly. Airstrikes began across the Gaza Strip, targeting Hamas infrastructure, command centers, and weapons facilities. What followed was an extended military campaign that would dominate international headlines for months. But the impact of the October 7th attack was not confined to Gaza. Across the region, tensions surged almost immediately. Along Israel's northern border, Hezbollah forces in Lebanon began exchanging fire with Israeli troops. Rocket launches and artillery strikes became increasingly frequent, raising fears that a second front could open. Regional governments watched nervously. Diplomats warned that the conflict had the potential to spread far beyond Israel and Gaza. At the center of those concerns was Iran. Although Iran denied direct involvement in the planning of the October 7th attack, Tehran had long maintained relationships with armed groups opposed to Israel, including both Hamas and Hezbollah. As the war in Gaza intensified, analysts began to ask a difficult question. Would the conflict remain contained, or could it trigger a broader regional confrontation, one that might eventually draw Iran and Israel into direct conflict? For months, the situation hovered in a dangerous state of uncertainty. Skirmishes continued along Israel's borders. Military forces across the region increased their readiness, and the shadow war that had defined the relationship between Iran and Israel for decades seemed to be approaching a turning point. By 2025, that turning point would finally arrive. Confrontation between the two states was about to move closer than ever to open military exchange. For years, the confrontation between Iran and Israel had been carefully contained. Strikes were limited, messages were indirect. Each side tested the other while avoiding the kind of escalation that could ignite a full regional war. But by 2025, that restraint was beginning to erode. The shadow war was no longer confined to covert operations and distant battlefields. It was moving closer to direct confrontation. Israeli intelligence had long warned that Iran's military infrastructure, including facilities connected to missile development and nuclear research, posed an increasing threat. As tensions continued to rise across the region, Israel launched a series of strikes targeting Iranian military and nuclear-linked sites. Some of these facilities were believed to be connected to weapons development programs. Others were associated with Iran's expanding missile capabilities. The strikes signaled a clear shift in strategy. Rather than relying solely on covert operations or proxy pressure, Israel was now willing to strike directly at Iranian targets it believed posed a strategic danger. Iran responded. Missiles and drones were launched toward Israeli territory, a rare and dramatic escalation in a conflict that had previously remained largely indirect. Air defense systems activated across Israel. Interceptors streaked across the sky as military commanders rushed to assess the scale of the attack. Although the exchanges remained limited, the message was unmistakable. The two countries had crossed a threshold. For the first time in decades, Iran and Israel were engaging in direct military exchanges. Even if those encounters were still controlled and measured, the precedent had been set. And once that line had been crossed, it became far more difficult to step back. Across the region, governments and security analysts began to warn that the confrontation between Iran and Israel was entering a new and unpredictable phase. Diplomatic channels remained active. Negotiations over Iran's nuclear program continued in international forums, but military tensions were now rising alongside those diplomatic efforts. Two parallel tracks, one diplomatic, one military, were moving forward at the same time. By early 2026, those paths would collide in a way that few leaders could ignore. A coordinated military operation would bring the long rivalry between Iran and Israel closer to open confrontation than ever before, an operation that would become known as Operation Epic Fury. In the final days of February 2026, the long and uneasy balance between Iran and Israel reached a critical moment. For months, tensions across the Middle East had been building. Missile exchanges in previous years had already broken long-standing taboos. Military forces across the region were on higher alert. Intelligence agencies were watching closely for signs that the confrontation might escalate further. At the same time, diplomats were still attempting to prevent exactly that outcome. In Geneva, negotiations over Iran's nuclear program were ongoing. Representatives from multiple countries were once again trying to find a path toward limiting nuclear development while reducing the risk of wider conflict. But diplomacy was unfolding against a backdrop of deep mistrust. Israeli leaders remained convinced that Iran's military capabilities, particularly its missile programs and nuclear infrastructure, represented an unacceptable threat. Iranian officials, for their part, accused Israel of repeated violations of international law through covert attacks and targeted strikes. The rivalry had reached a point where neither side fully trusted the other's intentions. Then, on February 28, 2026, the situation changed dramatically. Israeli and American forces launched a coordinated series of airstrikes on targets inside Iran in what officials later called Operation Epic Fury. The strikes targeted sites believed to be connected to Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. Aircraft moved quickly across the region. Precision-guided munitions struck facilities that intelligence officials had monitored for months. Within hours, the operation became one of the most significant direct military actions involving Iran in years. Governments across the Middle East reacted immediately. Regional leaders called for restraint. Energy markets fluctuated as investors worried about potential disruptions to global supply. Military forces in several countries increased their readiness levels in case the situation escalated further. What made the operation especially striking was its timing. The strikes occurred while diplomatic negotiations were still underway in Geneva. Diplomacy and military confrontation, two very different strategies, were now unfolding simultaneously. For decades, the rivalry between Iran and Israel had been fought in shadows. But Operation Epic Fury made one thing unmistakably clear. That shadow war had entered a far more dangerous phase. The confrontation between Iran and Israel did not emerge overnight. It evolved slowly, across decades of political change, regional conflict, and competing visions for the future of the Middle East. In the early years, the relationship between the two countries was pragmatic. Iran recognized Israel in 1948, and under the rule of the Shah, quiet cooperation developed through economic ties and intelligence contacts. But the Islamic Revolution of 1979 transformed Iran's political system and redefined its foreign policy. Diplomatic ties with Israel were cut, and the relationship quickly shifted from cautious cooperation to open hostility. For decades after that rupture, the conflict unfolded mostly in indirect ways. Alliances with regional groups, covert operations, cyber activity, and carefully calibrated strikes became the tools of a long-running shadow war. Then, slowly, the distance between the two rivals began to shrink. Regional conflicts expanded the battlefield. Military exchanges became more direct. And by the middle of the 2020s, the line separating covert rivalry from open confrontation had begun to blur. The events of February 2026 marked one of the clearest signs yet that the conflict had entered a new phase. Operation Epic Fury demonstrated how fragile the balance between deterrence and escalation had become. Yet, even after decades of rivalry, the ultimate direction of this conflict remains uncertain. Both countries possess significant military capabilities, both see the other as a strategic threat, and both operate in a region where local conflicts can rapidly expand into international crises. For now, diplomacy continues alongside military deterrence. Negotiations rise and fall, warnings are issued, alliances shift, but the central question remains unresolved. Will the rivalry between Iran and Israel stabilize into a tense but manageable standoff? Or is the region moving toward a confrontation that neither side truly intends, yet neither can fully avoid? Only time will answer that question, and the next chapter of this long conflict is still being written.